Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into a world of mud, smoke and rattling steel, where soldiers clutch their rifles a little tighter and tanks roll forward like iron beasts. We're in World War II, and you're standing on a front line that smells like wet canvas and burnt powder. Around you, there's that constant hum of fear, mixed with the sour smell of unwashed uniforms, stale coffee, and the metallic taste of nerves on your tongue. And fair warning, if you think you can just stroll through this story without getting singed, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is, because somewhere, someone is probably trying to fall asleep to the sound of artillery and a story about pipes turned into tank killers. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into the story with boots sinking slightly in wet soil. It's not just rainwater. It's the churn of vehicles, the endless back and forth of war that has turned the ground into a grey soup. Around you are men who have already seen too much. Their helmets sit low, rifles clatter softly as they shift, and every now and then someone coughs, a harsh, raspy sound that feels louder than it should. You feel the way silence stretches in war. It isn't really silence at all, but a waiting, a tension that pulls at your chest. Over the rise, you hear it before you see it. A German Panzer engine, low and steady, like a heartbeat carved from iron. The sound makes every soldier stiffen. You glance toward the men beside you, and you notice one has clenched his jaw so tight you wonder if his teeth will crack. Tanks aren't just machines here. They're nightmares with treads, lumbering monsters that rifles can't stop. You could empty every round you carry into one of those steel hulks, and it would just keep rolling. That's where tonight's story begins, not with glory, but with desperation. Soldiers in the early years of the war had almost nothing in their hands to deal with these armored threats. The British tried sticky bombs, glass spheres of nitroglycerin covered in adhesive. Sounds promising until you imagine yourself running toward a tank with a literal bomb glued to your hand, hoping it sticks before the machine gun on top chews you apart. Spoiler alert, a lot of those bombs stuck better to sweaty hands than to tank hulls. The Americans too were fumbling. Anti-tank rifles existed, but by 1941 most of them couldn't even scratch the paint on German armor. Imagine lugging a weapon nearly as tall as you are, firing it, and watching the bullet just bounce. It was like bringing a dart to a demolition derby. Still, these awkward experiments reveal how terrified infantrymen were of being defenseless against tanks. In an age before drones and laser-guided missiles, the idea of a foot soldier standing against a tank was almost laughable. Almost, but history has a way of laughing back. Some U.S. engineers, tinkering with rocket motors and shaped charges, started thinking, what if we could launch an explosive from a tube, far enough that the poor guy firing it didn't have to practically hug the tank? The shaped charge itself was genius. A cone of explosive designed to punch a narrow jet of molten copper straight through armor. Think of it like a blowtorch hidden inside a bomb, concentrating force into one deadly spot. This was the seed of what soldiers would later know as the bazooka, but we'll save the full tale of its invention for later. For now, picture yourself in this twilight zone of war. Rumors circulating that something new is coming, something that might let a single soldier stand against a tank. The older guys mutter about how it won't work. The younger ones, well, they're half hoping and half skeptical, the way you might feel if someone promised you a slingshot that could knock down an airplane. And let's pause for a moment on a quirky detail, the name itself. Bazooka. Doesn't exactly scream serious military hardware, does it? The name came from a silly musical contraption made of pipes by a comedian named Bob Burns. He'd puff into this thing and make goofy, sputtering sounds, and the soldiers, when they first saw the pipe-shaped rocket launcher, couldn't help but laugh and say, "Looks like Burns' bazooka." Sometimes, history's deadliest tools arrive wearing clown shoes. Meanwhile, historians still argue whether the U.S. High Command really believed in the weapon at first. Was it embraced as a game-changer? Or was it just another experimental toy that only survived because desperate troops insisted it worked? The truth probably lies somewhere in between. But you can almost hear the boardroom debates. Generals frowning over blueprints while some young officer insists, "Sir, this tube could stop a tank." Back at the front line, you shift your weight and glance again at the rise ahead. The Panzer's engine growls louder, closer. You feel the earth tremble under its weight. The man next to you whispers something about how even grenades won't help, not unless you climb on the thing and drop one down the hatch. You wonder what it must feel like to be that powerless, like watching a storm surge when you only have a bucket. But remember, every soldier out here clings to scraps of hope. Someone pulls a dented tin from his pocket. It's sardines, the salty kind that taste of brine and metal. He splits them with you, and the sharp smell fills your nose just as the tank crests the hill. The tin glints absurdly bright against the mud. You'll remember that tin later, when you're holding something else shaped like a pipe, pointing it at a tank and thinking, well, this had better work. For now, though, you hunker down, listening as the enemy machine draws near. In your chest, the heartbeat of war matches the rhythm of those iron treads. The story of the bazooka is about to begin, not just as a weapon, but as a strange kind of equalizer. It will make men believe they can stand their ground, even when steel giants rumble toward them. And here in this first moment, you're just waiting. Waiting for the weapon that might finally let a soldier face a tank and live to tell the tale. The tank rumbles away in your memory, but the dread it leaves behind lingers like the echo of thunder after a storm. You know the feeling now, standing there with nothing more than a rifle, watching a metal monster roll toward you. In those early years of the war, it felt like the Germans had discovered some kind of cheat code. Their tanks seemed invincible, their treads grinding across Europe while infantry scrambled to improvise. What did soldiers do when a tank bore down on them? They got creative, or at least desperate. Picture yourself clutching an old boy's anti-tank rifle. Britain's answer to the Panzer problem at the start of the war. It was nearly 5 feet long and weighed so much that dragging it through mud felt like hauling a stubborn mule. You'd crouch, line up the iron sights and squeeze the trigger. The recoil would punch your shoulder like a sledgehammer, and the round would fly, slam into armor, and ricochet with a pitiful ping. Imagine the humiliation of firing something labeled anti-tank and realizing it had less effect than flicking pebbles at a bus. The Germans, of course, weren't standing still. Their panzer divisions were already upgrading armor faster than most Allied weapons could adapt. The Panzer III, once vulnerable to certain guns, grew tougher with each variant. By the time soldiers lugged out those heavy rifles, the Germans had already layered their steel thicker. It was like showing up to a knife fight and realizing your opponent had swapped their blade for a refrigerator. Still, that didn't stop inventors and soldiers from trying. You hear about sticky bombs, glass jars filled with nitroglycerin and covered with an adhesive coating. The idea was simple. Run up to a tank, slap it on, and sprint away before it explodes. But let's be honest, who really wants to sprint toward a tank? And even if you did, the bomb's sticky surface often latched onto uniforms and fingers, instead of armor plates. Many soldiers swore off the device after near-disastrous oops moments in training. One British officer even joked, "They stick all right, just not to tanks." The French tried something equally peculiar, the rifle grenade. You'd slide a heavy grenade onto the end of your rifle, fire a blank cartridge, and hope the explosive actually landed somewhere useful. In practice, these clunky rounds often bounced or rolled under tanks harmlessly, leading soldiers to quip that they were better at startling stray cats than damaging panzers. And then there was the Polish cavalry's daring use of Molotov cocktails, bottles filled with gasoline, lit on fire and hurled at German armor. The flames could sometimes catch in air vents or engine grills, but more often than not, they just streaked across steel without much effect. You can imagine the smell of burning fuel, the desperate cheer as fire bloomed, followed by the sinking realization that the tank was still rolling forward. Quirky as these ideas were, they highlight a deeper truth. Armies were scrambling to even the odds. Historians still argue whether these improvisations were acts of brilliance or sheer futility. Did they represent courageous defiance, or were they signs of how utterly unprepared the Allies were against German mechanized warfare? Either way, the ingenuity is almost admirable. People looked at machines that seemed unstoppable and thought, what if I just throw glue at it? Now let's not forget the Americans in all of this. Before the bazooka, U.S. infantry relied heavily on the .50 caliber Browning machine gun. That beast of a weapon could shred soft-skinned vehicles and occasionally penetrate thinner armor. But lugging one into a foxhole fight was no simple task. It was loud, heavy, and about as subtle as a brass band at midnight. You could stop light armor, sure, but against a panzer, it felt like playing whack-a-mole with a sledgehammer, while the mole laughed at you. Another fact worth noting, by 1940, the German blitzkrieg had made it abundantly clear that tanks weren't just supporting units, they were the tip of the spear. Entire nations fell because tanks rolled faster than armies could respond. Infantry needed a countermeasure, something they could carry on their backs rather than tow behind trucks. The clock was ticking, and here's where the irony kicks in. The Germans themselves had started the war with little more than 37mm door-knocker cannons, nicknamed because they made more noise than impact against modern armor. They too faced the rapid obsolescence of their weapons, constantly racing to outdo Allied defenses. So in a strange way, every side was trapped in an arms race of steel versus firepower, a seesaw that tipped back and forth with each new invention. You crouch again in the mud, imagining yourself in 1941 with one of those primitive weapons. The fear wasn't just about tanks, it was about futility. Shooting at something you couldn't stop gnawed at morale. It wasn't just a battlefield problem. It was psychological warfare. Soldiers wrote home about their frustration, sometimes in letters censored by officers who didn't want the folks back home to know just how hopeless it felt. And here's a quirky little detail that often gets overlooked. Training films. The British and Americans churned out reels showing soldiers how to bravely attack tanks with grenades, bottles, or sticky bombs. The cheerful narrators made it sound easy, like a how-to guide for gardening. Step 1, approach tank. Step 2, apply bomb. Watching them today, you almost expect the voiceover to say, "Don't forget to smile." But for the men tasked with carrying it out, there was nothing cheerful about sprinting toward roaring treads with a bottle of gasoline. Of course, historians still debate just how effective any of these weapons really were. Some point to scattered reports of destroyed tanks and claim they worked. Others argue that most successes came from lucky shots, mechanical failures, or plain German overconfidence? The truth? Probably both. War is messy, and sometimes the line between genius and desperation blurs. So, as you sit in your bunker of imagination tonight, think about the soldiers who lay awake wondering, how do you fight a monster of steel with nothing more than a bottle, a glue bomb, or a clumsy rifle? Their world was one of trial and error, of trying anything, no matter how absurd, because doing nothing meant certain defeat. And soon, very soon, someone would take those scraps of ideas, explosives, pipes, rockets, and fuse them into something far more effective. The kind of weapon that would make a lone soldier feel like maybe, just maybe, he had a fighting chance when the next tank rolled over the hill. You wake the next morning to the rattle of metal and the smell of cold coffee brewed too long in a dented tin pot. Outside your tent, engineers are fussing over what looks suspiciously like a plumbing experiment gone wrong. A length of pipe, wires trailing, and a rocket sticking out one end. You rub your eyes and mutter something about needing more sleep. But someone nearby grins and says, "That's the future." Right there, the bazooka didn't arrive in the world with a trumpet fanfare. It sort of stumbled in, like a kid wandering onto the wrong stage play and deciding to stay. Its parentage? Half desperation, half mad science. The real spark came from a marriage of two separate ideas. First, the shaped charge warhead designed to focus explosive energy into a narrow armor-piercing jet. Second, the rocket motor, which could fling that warhead farther than anyone wanted to throw it by hand. Stick them together, slide them into a tube, and suddenly the average soldier could launch doom at an approaching tank. Here's the fun part. The weapon came together almost by accident. Colonel Leslie Skinner had been tinkering with small rockets at Aberdeen Proving Grounds. Meanwhile, Captain Edward Oule was struggling to find a way to deliver the new M10-shaped charge grenade. Put those two frustrated men in the same room, and by the summer of 1942, they'd lashed together a test rig from spare metal tubing and salvaged parts. Imagine the scene. Grease on their sleeves, blueprints smudged with coffee, someone muttering, "Well, let's just fire the thing and see if it blows up." And yes, it did fire. The rocket whooshed downrange, hit its target, and punched a clean hole through armor. Suddenly, an idea that sounded like science fiction was burning into reality. Of course, the army didn't exactly roll out the red carpet. Commanders had seen plenty of gadgets that looked great on paper and flopped in the field. The US military in the 1940s wasn't known for rushing unproven toys into the hands of soldiers. But when they saw a single man shoulder a pipe and cripple a tank, eyebrows rose higher than a sergeant catching a private sneaking extra rations. The design quickly went from clunky prototype to production model. Officially it was called the M1 rocket launcher, but no one liked that mouthful. Soldiers looked at the long tube and chuckled. It reminded them of Bob Burns, the comedian who played his silly homemade instrument, the bazooka. The nickname stuck faster than mud on boots. One of history's deadliest infantry weapons was now named after a joke. Only in war could a word so ridiculous take on such a terrifying edge. Let's not forget the first models were far from perfect. The early M1 bazookas had reliability issues, the kind that could turn your palms sweaty. Rockets sometimes sputtered instead of launching. Wires shorted out in the rain. A backblast of fire roared from the rear, which was great unless your buddy happened to be standing behind you. Soldiers learned fast. Never crouch directly behind a bazooka unless you enjoy singed eyebrows. But despite those quirks, the potential was undeniable. In a world where tanks felt unstoppable, This was the first weapon that gave a foot soldier the psychological edge of saying, "I might have a chance." And morale in war is worth more than gold. Now, here's a quirky detail that rarely makes it into the main history books. Some of the very first bazookas were rushed to the front line almost unfinished. By late 1942, the US was desperate to field test the weapon, so factories cranked out crude versions. Soldiers received them with minimal manuals, sometimes handwritten instructions stuffed in the box. Imagine being told, "Here's a tube, a rocket, and a wire. Point it at a tank and hope it works." That was training, Wii style. Historians still argue whether the weapon's invention was truly revolutionary or just another step in the inevitable march of technology. Was the bazooka a miracle that changed infantry warfare overnight, or was it simply the right idea at the right time, destined to appear sooner or later? The debate continues, with some scholars pointing to Germany's later Panzerfaust as the real infantry tank killer, while others insist the bazooka was the spark that lit that fire. For you, though standing in that field workshop, the debate doesn't matter. You watch a soldier crouch, slip a rocket into the pipe and connect the battery wires. He shoulders it awkwardly, like it's a bassoon in the hands of a nervous orchestra student. Then comes the command, "Fire!" and a whoosh that makes your heart leap. The rocket streaks forward, slamming into an old armor plate with a metallic thud and a flash. When the smoke clears, there's a neat, jagged hole right where steel should have been solid. Every man watching lets out the same low whistle. For the first time, they believe that infantry might be able to take the fight to tanks without relying on heavy artillery or divine intervention. You run your hand along the cool metal of the tube, half awed, half skeptical. This is no polished, gleaming rifle. It feels like something built in a garage. Yet there's a strange power in its simplicity. It's just a pipe, some wires, and a rocket, but in your hands it's a slingshot against Goliath, and the timing couldn't be better. Out in the deserts of North Africa, German armor was making life miserable for Allied infantry. The bazooka was about to get its first taste of real combat. Soldiers would soon find out if this pipe and rocket contraption was a miracle worker or just another dud in a long line of tank-busting failures. For now, though you stand in that dusty proving ground, smoke drifting across your vision, ears ringing from the backblast, you can't help but laugh quietly. The weapon may be deadly, but its name, bazooka, still sounds like something a clown would pull from a circus trunk. And yet, in the strangest twist of war, this pipe named after a joke might just change the battlefield forever. The first time you hear the word bazooka, you can't help but picture a vaudeville stage, not a battlefield. Some comedian in suspenders puffing on a ridiculous brass and plumbing contraption, blowing out sputtering notes while the crowd chuckles. And that's exactly where the name came from. Bob Burns, an Arkansas-born entertainer, had invented his musical bazooka back in the 1920s. It was little more than a piece of gas pipe, a funnel and a trombone mouthpiece, good for goofy sounds, and not much else. So when American GIs first laid eyes on the Army's brand new rocket launcher, they couldn't resist. A long metal tube, awkward to carry, clumsy to aim. Yeah, it looked exactly like Burns's silly instrument. The name stuck almost instantly. Forget the formal designation M1 rocket launcher. No soldier was going to yell that across a battlefield. Instead it was, "Hand me the bazooka!" And suddenly history had its tank killer with a comedian's nickname. There's something delightfully ironic about that. War is supposed to be grim and serious, yet soldiers constantly smuggled humor into it. Giving a silly name to something terrifying was a kind of coping mechanism. You could grin at the word bazooka, even as you loaded an explosive round meant to rip through a tank. It softened the edge of fear, at least until the trigger was squeezed. The first batches of bazookas, those M1 models, were rushed overseas by late 1942. They looked ungainly, nearly 5 feet long, a thin tube with crude sights and a clunky trigger wired to a dry cell battery. Soldiers joked that it seemed more like something stolen from a high school science fair than a serious weapon. But then they fired it. The roar, the streaking rocket, the sudden hole in armor, no one was laughing after that. Of course the Germans were, at least at first. The Wehrmacht had spent years perfecting its armor, believing that infantry couldn't possibly field anything man-portable that could stop a panzer. When whispers of a handheld rocket gun reached their ears, many officers dismissed it as propaganda. Tanks had shrugged off grenades, anti-tank rifles, even Molotov cocktails. Why should a glorified pipe be any different? But the bazooka's real power wasn't just in what it could do, it was in what it represented. For the first time, an ordinary rifleman didn't have to look at a tank and feel utterly helpless. Suddenly, a two-man team with a tube could stand their ground instead of diving for ditches. That shift in morale alone was worth its weight in steel. There's a quirky detail worth savoring here: the training films. When the army introduced the bazooka, it quickly churned out reels showing how to use it. Grainy black-and-white footage of smiling soldiers loading rockets, aiming at plywood targets and firing with perfect form. The narrators were almost cheerful, like they were explaining how to bake a cake. Step 1. Insert rocket. Step 2. Aim carefully. Step 3. Fire. In reality, things were less tidy. The backblast could ignite dry grass. The rockets sometimes fizzled out and skittered along the ground. And heaven help the loader who forgot to duck. Even so, the new name caught on faster than the weapon itself. Letters home from soldiers began mentioning the bazooka before many families even knew what it was. Kids back in the States would shout the word in playgrounds, pretending broomsticks were rocket launchers. Bob Burns, the comedian, was amused to find his gag instrument suddenly sharing a name with a battlefield terror. He even joked in radio broadcasts about how his silly contraption was helping win the war. Yet beneath the humor lay serious debates. Historians still argue whether the bazooka was genuinely effective in its earliest form. The M1 fired a 2.36-inch rocket, decent against light and medium tanks, but struggling against newer, heavier models. Some scholars claim the weapon's psychological boost outweighed its practical effect. Others argue that used correctly, it was lethal enough to force Germans to rethink their tactics. The truth probably sits somewhere in the messy middle, as it often does in war. For you, though, crouched in a foxhole with mud creeping into your boots, the name matters less than the sound. You hear the first real combat launch, the whoosh of a rocket streaking towards steel. It slams into the side of a tank with a sharp crack, and for a heartbeat the impossible seems possible. The monster of iron can bleed. It's not perfect. You notice how slow the reload is, how exposed the gunner feels while aiming. You notice the loader's hands trembling as he slips another rocket into the tube. And when the backblast scorches the sandbag wall behind you, you make a mental note. Always stay clear of that tail end. But still, you can't deny the grin tugging at the corner of your mouth. The bazooka is here. The battlefield has changed, and yet as you wipe sweat from your brow, you realize something else. War is never static. The Germans won't stay shocked for long. Already you can imagine engineers in grey coats back in Berlin, sketching counters, planning thicker armor, or perhaps designing their own versions of this strange new weapon. The bazooka may have arrived with a laugh, but its story is about to get serious. Because next stop? North Africa. The desert heat, the blinding sun, and the first real duels where America's tank killer would face off against the Wehrmacht's pride. And there, in the swirling dust, soldiers would find out if the goofy-named pipe really could tilt the balance of war. The sun burns white over the North African desert, and you can feel the grit of sand between your teeth, as if you've been chewing it for breakfast. Heat presses down like a hammer, and every breath tastes of dust and sweat. Out there, past the shimmer of the horizon, a German panzer column crawls forward, steel hulls glinting under the relentless sky. You squint and wonder if the bazooka you've been lugging will finally prove itself, or just end up as another awkward experiment destined for the scrap heap. North Africa, late 1942. The U.S. Army was green, still finding its footing against veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps. The bazooka had arrived almost as suddenly as the American troops themselves. Crates of them, shipped straight from stateside factories, were pried open on the sand. Manuals were thin, often vague, and the soldiers holding the long tubes looked at each other with raised eyebrows. One man muttered, "It's just plumbing with fireworks." Another slapped the side of the tube and said, "Well, let's hope it's plumbing that kills tanks." The first test came in the shadow of dunes. A Panzer III, medium tank and pride of the German armoured spearhead, rolled across the sand with confidence. Its machine gun sprayed bursts that tore plumes of dirt into the air. Behind a low ridge, you crouch with a bazooka team. The gunner steadies the tube on his shoulder, while the loader fumbles a rocket into the breech. The battery wire is clipped. The trigger is sweaty in his hands. Fire! The whoosh tears across the desert air, startling even the men who pulled it. The rocket streaks out, wobbling slightly, then slams into the Panzer's side with a flash. Smoke erupts. The tank halts, steel groaning. You feel a cheer rise up in your throat. The impossible, stopping a tank with a tube and a rocket, suddenly looks possible. But war isn't neat, and not every shot ended in glory. Sometimes the rocket fizzled, landing in the sand like a dud firework on the 4th of July. Other times it hit the tank but failed to penetrate, leaving only scorch marks on the armor. The desert echoed with curses as crews scrambled to reload under fire. And always, there was that dangerous backblast, a flare of fire and dust that screamed to enemy gunners, "Shoot here!" Still, the Germans took notice. Until then, Afrika Korps crews had driven with confidence, their armor shrugging off most Allied weapons. Now stories began to spread. Tanks disabled by lone infantrymen crouching in dunes, ambushes in narrow wadis where a rocket came hissing out of nowhere. The Germans may have called the weapon a toy at first, but toys don't leave holes in panzers. Quirky detail. The first rockets often came painted bright colors, greens and yellows that looked almost playful, as if someone had mixed up boxes destined for a carnival. Soldiers joked that they were firing circus rounds. Some even drew doodles or wrote names on them before slipping them into the tube, the way a pilot might chalk a message on a bomb. One private scrawled "To Rommel with love" across his rocket in chalk. He swore later that it was the one that scored a hit. Now historians still argue about how decisive those first North African launches really were. Some claim the bazooka turned the tide in infantry tank encounters. Others argue the weapon was too unreliable and too weak against heavier models, saying its impact was more psychological than practical. But what no one disputes is how quickly the bazooka forced the Germans to rethink their armor strategy. Suddenly, infantry squads weren't just gnats buzzing around tanks. They were wasps, capable of stinging. You lie flat in the sand, watching another launch. The rocket whooshes out, trailing smoke that lingers like a chalk line across the sky. It smashes into the tracks of a panzer, throwing up sparks and dust. The tank shudders to a halt, immobile, its crew scrambling out. Your heart pounds. You can almost taste the victory mixed in with the grit of the desert. But the bazooka wasn't just for tanks. Soldiers quickly discovered it made a superb bunker buster. A rocket could punch through sandbag walls, cave in dugouts, or silence machine gun nests hiding in rocky outcroppings. In a desert where cover was scarce, that flexibility was priceless. One sergeant quipped, "If it moves, we shoot it. If it doesn't move, we still shoot it." Of course, nothing is perfect. The batteries that powered the firing system often corroded in the desert heat. Rockets warped in the sun, swelling until they stuck in the tube. And the sheer size of the weapon made it awkward to carry through soft sand. More than one bazooka team found themselves tripping, tumbling and cursing as the long tube caught on rocks or tent poles. It was hardly elegant, but elegance isn't what wins wars. Let's add a scholarly debate for good measure. Historians still puzzle over whether Rommel himself ever directly witnessed bazooka strikes during his campaigns. Some argue that his reports hint at awareness of new American rocket weapons. Others claim those mentions referred instead to British boys' rifles or captured Soviet anti-tank weapons. The documents are ambiguous, leaving experts to bicker like academics at a dinner party, except with more maps of North Africa spread across the table. For the soldiers, though, debates didn't matter. What mattered was the feeling that for the first time you could shoulder a weapon and challenge steel giants. You could look at a panzer and think, "I've got a shot." That kind of hope is its own weapon. As the desert sun sinks low, shadows stretch across the dunes. You wipe sand from your mouth, your ears still ringing from the last backblast. The bazooka rests heavy in your hands, its tube scorched, its paint chipped. You know it's clumsy, temperamental, and dangerous even to its user, but you also know you've seen it do the impossible. The desert wind carries the smell of burnt cordite and hot metal. You grin despite yourself. The Germans thought they owned the desert with their tanks. Tonight you've got a pipe that sings a different tune, a tune with a silly name, but one that makes even steel giants stumble. And with North Africa as its proving ground, the bazooka's reputation is only just beginning to echo across battlefields. Sicily awaits with its narrow streets and stone villages, where the bazooka will earn both fame and infamy in equal measure. The desert winds are still fresh in your memory when the scene shifts to Europe. North Africa had been a trial run, but it's in Sicily during the summer of 1943 that the bazooka really begins to whisper its name into German ears. The invasion of the island is brutal. Dusty hills, crumbling stone villages, olive groves dotted with machine gun nests. And threading through all of this are Panzer III and IV tanks, their turrets swiveling down narrow roads like watchful predators. You're crouched in a Sicilian alleyway, cobblestones slick with humidity. Chickens scatter at your boots, frightened by the distant growl of armor. The bazooka feels heavier than ever in this tight space, its long tube threatening to snag on every doorway and clothesline. Your loader curses softly as he fumbles a rocket, its green paint smudged from sweaty hands. The first German tank clanks into view. Its tracks grind over the stones with a sound like a grinding millstone. You press your back to the wall, heart racing. The narrow street works in your favor. There's no room for the tank to maneuver. If the bazooka can work here, you'll own the alley. The shot hisses out with a roar. For a hot beat, you see the rocket trail glowing against the evening shadows. Then it slams into the Panzer's side. The explosion rocks the street. When the smoke clears, the tank is halted, its engine coughing smoke. The infantry behind it scatter, shouting. For once, the alley belongs to you. It's here in Sicily that the bazooka begins to change the way infantry fight. Before, facing a tank in a narrow street was practically a death sentence. Soldiers would retreat, hide, or pray for artillery. Now, with a bazooka, 2 men could ambush armor where it was most vulnerable. Certainly alleys weren't traps, they were kill zones. Of course, nothing in war is ever that simple. The early rockets sometimes skittered off the rounded armor of a Panzer of 4, bouncing away like angry bees. You quickly learn that angles matter. Hitting a tank straight on isn't always effective. You need the rocket to strike at the right slant. Soldiers swap tips in hushed tones, treating the bazooka less like a weapon and more like a stubborn mule that performs only if you coax it correctly. Quirky detail. In Sicily, some soldiers painted crude crosshairs or even little cartoons on their bazookas, as if the weapon were a personal pet. One corporal named his Bertha and insisted on scratching tallies into the tube after each launch, though whether those tallies marked hits or just firings, nobody ever figured out. Another painted his bazooka with zebra stripes, claiming it made the weapon invisible in alleys. His squad called him crazy. But in war you take whatever comfort you can find. Meanwhile, the Germans were learning fast. Reports began filtering back to Berlin about this strange new weapon in American hands. Tank crews started welding on makeshift skirts of steel, called Schürzen, to protect against shaped charges. Did they work? Sometimes. Other times, the bazooka rockets punched through anyway, leaving German engineers scratching their heads. Historians still argue whether these skirts were genuinely effective or just psychological padding for crews who were rattled by the idea of a single soldier knocking out their machines. And here's where the story gets even more interesting. The Germans didn't just adapt, they copied. Captured bazookas were shipped back across the continent, examined by engineers, and soon inspired the development of the Panzerfaust, a single-shot disposable launcher. That weapon would later become infamous, but its roots trace right back to the Sicilian alleys, where American soldiers first proved the bazooka's worth. In a sense, the joke name had leapt borders, becoming a deadly idea too tempting for the enemy to ignore. But for you, in that humid stone village, none of this matters yet. What matters is the way your pulse steadies after that first successful hit. What matters is that the tank you thought would crush you is now belching smoke and backing away. For the first time, infantry doesn't just endure the presence of armor. It challenges it. The campaign drags on, heat and exhaustion soaking into every pore. The bazooka becomes part of daily life, slung across shoulders as naturally as rifles. You grow accustomed to its quirks, its dangers, even its weight. You also grow accustomed to the fear it inspires in the enemy. German infantry that once advanced boldly now hesitate, scanning alleys and windows, wary of the unseen rocket. That hesitation buys you seconds, and in war seconds can be everything. Still, the bazooka isn't a miracle cure. Heavy German armor, especially the dreaded Tigers beginning to appear in small numbers, can shrug off rockets. You and your squad trade frustrated glances when a rocket slams into thick frontal armor and simply scorches the paint. Against those beasts, you learn to aim for tracks, for side panels, for anything that might cripple mobility. It's not about killing the tank outright. It's about blinding, hobbling, slowing it down until bigger guns can finish the job. Another quirky moment, bazooka backblast in Sicilian villages sometimes set thatched roofs or wooden shutters on fire. Nothing kills the thrill of knocking out a tank faster than realizing you've also ignited someone's laundry line. Local civilians were equal parts horrified and fascinated by the weapon. Some called it the fire tube, and children would peek around corners to watch launches, their wide eyes reflecting the flash. Historians still debate whether Sicily was the true coming-of-age moment for the bazooka, or whether its fame really took off later in Normandy. Some argue Sicily was merely a preview, its narrow streets a laboratory for ambush tactics. Others insist the campaign proved beyond doubt that the bazooka had earned its place in every infantry platoon. Either way, Sicily showed the world that the pipe named after a joke could no longer be dismissed as comic relief. As the campaign winds down, you lean against a cracked wall, bazooka tube resting across your lap. The weapon is battered now, its paint chipped, its edges scarred. It's far from perfect, but it has given you something priceless, confidence. The knowledge that when steel rolls into your street, you can roll it right back out. And as you close your eyes, listening to the distant rumble of retreating panzers, you know one thing for certain: the Germans will never laugh at the word bazooka again. The smell of Sicily's olive groves fades from your memory, replaced now by the sharper tang of grease, gun oil, and canvas. You're back at camp, and the officers have decided it's time to train the rookie gunner, which, unfortunately, means you, the bazooka, for all its battlefield mystique, is not exactly user-friendly. It's heavy, awkward, and long enough to poke the soldier in front of you if you march too close. The army insists on running you through the basics. And so here you are, crouched in the dirt with a tube that looks suspiciously like a drain pipe. Your instructor, a sergeant who has probably repeated this spiel 100 times, growls out the rules. 2-man team. Gunner aims, loader feeds. Don't swap unless you're both still breathing. He taps the tube for emphasis. Never forget the backblast. This thing spits fire like a dragon. You want to keep your eyebrows? Stay clear of the tail. You chuckle nervously, but the warning is real. Behind you, the blackened ground testifies to the scorched earth where yesterday's practice burned a neat patch of grass down to ash. One poor private had learned the hard way, standing directly behind the bazooka when it fired, his uniform sleeve singed to a crisp. The smell lingered long after, somewhere between roasted coffee and despair. Now it's your turn. Your loader, equally green, fumbles with the rocket round. It's bulky, painted olive drab with fins that look like they belong on a child's toy plane. He slides it carefully into the breech, muttering a quick prayer under his breath. The sergeant clamps a hand on your shoulder. "Steady," he says. "Line her up." Sight's just a suggestion, remember. Rockets don't fly straight like bullets. You shoulder the weapon, feeling its weight tug against your muscles. Sweat drips into your eyes, not just from heat, but from nerves. Ahead, a battered tank carcass waits as the target. Your finger hovers on the trigger, which is little more than a crude contact wired to a battery. It feels ridiculously fragile, as if all of modern tank warfare now depends on a flashlight switch. You squeeze, whoosh. The rocket leaps from the tube, trailing a streak of smoke. It slams into the side of the target with a flash and a puff of dust. When the echo fades, everyone around you breaks into grins. You've done it, fired the bazooka and lived to tell the tale. The sergeant claps you on the back. "Not bad, rookie. Now do it again." Training quickly reveals the bazooka's quirks. The rockets don't always behave. Sometimes they spiral off wildly, exploding against a tree stump 50 yards to the left. Sometimes they refuse to launch at all, leaving you crouched with a smoking tube while the sergeant screams for you to clear it. The loader has his own challenges, getting the round into the breech smoothly, keeping the fins from bending, remembering to duck before you fire. You both start to move like dancers, one sliding the rocket in, the other shouldering the tube, both knowing a misstep can end in disaster. Quirky detail: the bazooka's early firing mechanism relied on dry cell batteries, the kind you'd expect in a flashlight. In damp conditions, those batteries often fizzled. Soldiers, improvising as always, sometimes stuffed the cells into their armpits or sat on them to keep them warm. You can imagine the sight. Half a platoon of men hugging batteries like they're comfort toys, muttering, "Work, you little devils, work." Historians still argue about how effective this training really was. Some say the army rushed rookies through too quickly, giving them only the bare minimum before throwing them into combat. Others counter that the bazooka was simple enough that even limited practice sufficed. What's certain is that plenty of soldiers fired their first real shot, not in training but under fire. With German tanks bearing down, back in your tent that night, you and your loader laugh about your first practice. "Did you see that shot?" "Dead center," he brags. You remind him it's only practice, but deep down you feel the same flicker of pride. For once, you don't feel like just another target waiting for a tank's tread. You feel like you might actually fight back, and yet the doubts linger. What if the rocket fails in combat? What if you miss? What if the panzer rolling toward you is a tiger, with armor too thick for your little shaped charge? The questions swirl as you try to sleep, the bazooka's silhouette leaning against the tent wall like a sentry. The sergeant's words echo in your ears. Two-man team, gunner and loader. Don't swap unless you're both still breathing. You understand now. It's not just a rule. It's a reminder of how fragile you are out there, crouched with a tube against a monster. You don't just need skill. You need trust. Without your loader, you're nothing but a soldier hugging a pipe. Without you, he's just a guy holding rockets with nowhere to put them. Still, training does its job. Each day your motions grow smoother, your nerves steadier. You and your partner begin to move in rhythm. The bazooka is no longer a mystery. It's part of you, part of your squad, part of the fragile hope that maybe infantrymen aren't doomed to cower before tanks forever. When the next campaign comes, and you crouch in another alley or hedge, you'll remember this moment. The first shaky shot, the laughter afterward, the sudden belief that the word bazooka might mean survival after all. The cicadas hum in the Sicilian heat, but you barely notice. Your hands are slick with sweat as you crouch in the shadow of a stone wall, the bazooka heavy on your shoulder. A narrow street stretches ahead, lined with shuttered windows and sagging laundry lines. And at the far end, clattering forward like some armored beetle, a German Panzer IV grinds toward you. Your loader kneels beside you, fumbling with the next rocket. His hands shake. You don't blame him. The street is barely wide enough for the tank, and its turret swings left and right like a giant eye. You can almost hear it sniffing you out. This is where the bazooka becomes more than a weapon. In these tight Sicilian streets, it's a game changer. Before, an infantryman in an alley had only two choices, run or die. But now, with a pipe, a rocket, and a steady aim, you can make even steel hesitate. Load it, you whisper. The rocket slides in. You shoulder the tube, sighting through the crude iron ring. Your heartbeat thumps so loudly you think the tank crew might hear it. The Panzer's engine growls, gears grinding. You squeeze. Whoosh! The rocket streaks across the alley, trailing smoke. It slams into the tank's side with a blast that shakes the laundry lines above. For a moment, nothing. Then, smoke, fire, and the squeal of treads grinding to a halt. Soldiers scatter. The alley belongs to you. It's a victory, but not a clean one. The backblast has scorched the wall behind you, and the smoke trail hangs like a beacon in the air. Enemy rifles crack from windows. You duck as plaster shatters over your head. The bazooka is no subtle assassin. It's a cannon with a calling card, and everyone nearby knows exactly where you fired from. Still, the impact is undeniable. Ambushes like these ripple through Sicily. Small squads with bazookas transform narrow lanes into tank traps. Panzer crews begin to dread villages, where every corner might hide a two-man team with a rocket tube. You watch German infantry grow more cautious, scanning rooftops and alley mouths before stepping forward. The balance has shifted, even if only slightly. Quirky detail. Soldiers often found themselves firing at absurdly close ranges in these cramped environments. Training suggested 100 yards was ideal, but in Sicily, shots were sometimes taken at 20 or 30 yards, close enough to smell the fuel and hear the tank commander shouting. A few daring souls even waited until tanks nearly rolled over them before firing upward at the underbelly. One GI joked, "At that range I could have just thrown the tube at 'em." The bazooka also proved handy against strong points. Machine gun nests tucked into barns or bunkers crumbled under the shaped charge blast. You recall one afternoon when a stubborn farmhouse bristled with German fire. The squad pinned down, you crept to a side window, raised the bazooka and fired. The wall cracked open like a rotten egg and silence followed. When you walked through later, the only thing left standing was a broken table and the smell of scorched plaster. Historians still debate just how decisive the bazooka was in Sicily. Some argue its real value lay not in the number of tanks destroyed, but in the fear it sowed. Panzer commanders, once bold in city streets, began hesitating. Others insist that without bazookas, infantry casualties would have been far higher. The truth? Probably both. The weapon's practical success varied, but its psychological impact was enormous. Of course, the Germans weren't slow to adapt. Armor plating was thickened, skirting added, tactics adjusted. Some crews improvised wire mesh screens along their tanks, hoping to detonate rockets before they struck armor. Did it work? Sometimes. More often, the rocket still punched through, leaving little more than angry scorch marks on steel. Yet those visible scars, the proof that even if the tank survived, it wasn't untouchable, gnawed at German confidence. There's another quirky scene etched into your memory. After one battle, villagers gathered in the street, staring at the wreck of a panzer smoldering in the sun. Children circled the hulking ruin, wide-eyed, pointing at the hole in its side. An old man muttered a prayer, then spat on the tank's tread. You realize the bazooka doesn't just shift tactics, it shifts morale. Civilians see that these monsters of steel can bleed, but the weapon isn't perfect and you feel its flaws keenly. Reloading under fire is nerve-wracking. Rockets are bulky, and carrying enough means leaving behind other gear. And there's the constant fear of misfire. The sudden silence when you pull the trigger and nothing happens. More than one soldier learned the hard way that an unexploded rocket inside the tube is a problem, best handled by running very far, very fast. At night, you clean the weapon with careful hands. The tube is scorched, the paint chipped, the edges rough. It feels less like a tool and more like a companion now. Temperamental, dangerous, but vital. Your loader snores nearby and you glance at him with gratitude. You know you'd never manage without him. The bazooka is not a one-man show. It's trust embodied in steel and explosives, and somewhere across the lines German engineers are sketching. They've seen captured bazookas. They've handled them, measured them, studied the warheads. Soon they'll roll out their own answers. The Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck, proof that ideas in war spread as fast as fear. For now, though you sit in a Sicilian square, the night air heavy with dust and smoke, the bazooka rests beside you, a battered tube with a laughable name. You stare at it and think about how strange it is that a weapon so absurd-looking, so ungainly, could make such an outsized mark on the war. The campaign will soon move north, toward the hedgerows of Normandy, where the bazooka will meet its next great test. But tonight, as you watch the stars above a battered Italian village, you know one thing. The tank no longer owns the street. The firelight flickers low in a ruined farmhouse, casting long shadows across cracked plaster and broken beams. You sit cross-legged, bazooka tube resting against the wall beside you, listening as stories ripple through the squad. Soldiers swap tales as though trading baseball cards, each one bigger than the last, each one pushing the limits of believability. And here in the soft glow of the embers, the bazooka begins to slip from weapon to legend. One private leans forward, eyes gleaming. I swear I saw a single bazooka gunner stop an entire armored column. 6 panzers, maybe more. He just kept firing, bam, 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 like something out of the movies. The others nod, half awed, half skeptical. Someone laughs into their tin mug of watery coffee and mutters, "Sure he did. And I bet he flew away on wings after that." That's the thing about war. Facts and myths blur together until nobody's quite sure where truth ends and tall tale begins. The bazooka, barely a year old in combat, already carries with it the aura of a superweapon. For foot soldiers who had once cowered helplessly before tanks, it feels almost magical to imagine one man standing tall, shouldering a tube and halting steel in its tracks. But you, sitting in that dim farmhouse, know the truth is messier. You've seen rockets miss-fizzle or bounce off angled armor. You've seen loaders drop rounds in panic, scrambling to wipe dust from fins before shoving them back into the breach. The bazooka is powerful, yes, but it isn't invincible. And no single man has ever truly stopped an armored column alone. Not without luck, not without terrain, not without dozens of other soldiers supporting. Still the legend grows. Letters home speak of heroes who took out tanks single-handed. Newspapers back in the States print stories of brave bazooka men standing against impossible odds. Hollywood scripts practically write themselves, turning an awkward pipe into a symbol of defiance. The truth, that it's always 2 men, that the weapon is temperamental, that success is rarely clean, doesn't make for good copy. There's a quirky detail here worth savoring. Some soldiers began calling themselves bazookaneers, like pirates with rockets instead of cutlasses. They'd paint names on their tubes: Tank Buster, Hot Lips, even Mickey's Pipe. One man in Italy lugged his launcher everywhere, even to the latrine, insisting he wouldn't be caught unarmed. His comrades teased him mercilessly, but when he knocked out a panzer that rolled into camp one dawn, the teasing stopped. Historians still argue about just how much of the bazooka myth is propaganda and how much is reality. Did soldiers truly stop whole columns, or did after-action reports simply exaggerate? Some records suggest inflated claims. Every squad wanted to believe they'd been the ones to cripple German armor. Others hint that on rare occasions, well-placed ambushes did wipe out multiple vehicles in succession. The truth lies tangled in the fog of war, where memory, fear, and pride mix freely. You shift, pulling your jacket tighter against the chill. Outside, the countryside hums with night insects. Inside, the squad's laughter rises and falls. The loader sitting beside you jabs you with his elbow. One day they'll tell stories about us. Bet you'll be the guy who killed a tiger all by yourself. You grin wryly and reply, "Only if you remember to load faster." That's the part myths always leave out. The loader, sweating and terrified, crouched inches from the gunner. The teamwork, the unspoken trust, the frantic rhythm of one man aiming while the other slides another round home. In the stories, it's always one man, one bazooka. In reality, it's always two, and often a dozen more, covering flanks, spotting targets, keeping the team alive long enough to fire. And yet, you can't quite deny the power of the myth. Because when word spreads that a lone bazooka man stopped tanks, every GI carrying the tube feels just a little braver. Every time you shoulder it, you wonder, maybe you could be that story. Maybe, with luck and courage, you could fire the shot that halts steel. In war, belief can be as valuable as bullets. The Germans, too, hear the whispers. Tank crews grow twitchier. Infantry escorts keep closer watch, nervous eyes scanning rubble and hedgerows. Even when the bazooka isn't fired, its reputation weighs on the battlefield like an unseen hand. A weapon that sometimes fails still terrifies if the enemy believes it never does. Quirky little scene. In one village, after a bazooka disabled a panzer, locals paraded the wreckage like a trophy. Children clambered onto the hull shouting, "Boom! Boom!" while GIs laughed and took photos. One soldier quipped, "The bazooka's better than Santa Claus, at least the kids believe in it." And here's where historians still debate. Did the bazooka truly alter tactics at this stage? Or was it more of a morale weapon? Some argue its real role was psychological, buying time until heavier Allied weapons arrived. Others insist it was genuinely lethal, forcing Germans to rethink how they used armor in villages and ambush-prone terrain. The answer, as always, depends on which after-action report you trust. You lean back against the farmhouse wall, eyelids heavy. The myth swirls around you like smoke. Part of you scoffs, knowing the bazooka is just a finicky tube. Part of you wonders, what if the stories are true at least sometimes? What if one rocket, fired at the right moment, really can halt giants? Outside, dawn creeps closer. Soon you'll shoulder the bazooka again, loader at your side, and step into streets where stone walls echo with the clang of tracks. And when you do, you'll carry not just the weapon itself, but the weight of every story, every whispered legend, every tall tale told around the fire. Because whether or not the myth is true, the belief that it might be, that is enough to steady your hands, to calm your breath, and to squeeze the trigger when the tank comes around the corner. The farmhouse fades, and now you're trudging across a frozen field somewhere far from Sicily. The war has a way of stretching across continents like a patchwork quilt, pulling soldiers into climates they never dreamed they'd fight in. Your boots crunch in snow, your breath puffs white, and your hands are numb even through gloves. But slung across your back, heavier than ever, is the same long tube, the bazooka. Only this time, it's not just Americans eyeing it with interest. Because word has spread. Allies trade tools the way neighbors share garden shears. Through the vast arteries of Lend-Lease, crates of bazookas make their way to the Soviet Union. American pilots ferry them across icy skies. Freighters carry them through Arctic convoys stalked by U-boats, and Red Army soldiers pry open the crates with frostbitten fingers. Inside, they find the curious pipe and rocket contraption that Americans swear can humble German armor. You stand beside a Soviet infantryman, his quilted jacket dusted with snow, his breath steaming in the air. He squints at the bazooka like it's an alien artifact. "Amerikansky Truber," he mutters, American pipe. He hefts it, testing the balance, then shrugs. He's seen stranger things. The Soviets already have their own anti-tank methods. Molotov cocktails, magnetic mines, the RPG-43 grenade with its crude-shaped charge. They've even experimented with launching grenades from rifles, much like the French did earlier in the war. But this bazooka feels different. It promises range, punch, and maybe a dash of glamour. If nothing else, it's better than running at a tank with a flaming bottle. Quirky detail. Soviet manuals translated the bazooka's instructions into Russian, but often poorly. One guide suggested, "Do not allow comrade to stand behind tube unless he wishes fire in his face." Soldiers laughed, called it American humor, and stuck the page to a barracks wall like a poster. The warning, of course, was real. The backblast was just as dangerous in Russian snow as in Sicilian alleys. You watch as a Soviet gunner kneels in the drifts, loader at his side. They aim at a wrecked Panzer Hulk, left abandoned in the village square. The whoosh echoes through the frosty air, smoke curling white against the blue sky. The rocket slams home, leaving a fresh hole beside the old scars. A cheer goes up, rough and guttural. For these soldiers, weary of charging steel with bare hands, the bazooka feels like a gift from the gods. Yet historians still argue, did the bazooka really change much for the Soviets? Some claim they used it enthusiastically, integrating it into infantry units. Others insist it was quickly sidelined in favor of their own weapons, like the RPG-43, and later RPG-6 grenades. Records are patchy and memories contradictory. The debate lingers like frost on the windows of history. You march on with them, the bazooka bumping against your back. In muddy trenches outside Leningrad, in forests near Kursk, in snow-swept fields beyond Moscow, Soviet soldiers give the weapon a try. Some embrace it, others curse its quirks. The unreliable batteries, the temperamental rockets, the awkward size in tight fighting. Too big, one grumbles, slinging it aside in favor of grenades. Another pats the tube fondly, swearing it saved his life when a panzer lurched into his foxhole. There's a moment you won't forget. A Red Army gunner, barely more than a boy, steadies the bazooka against a log. His loader crouches close, shivering. A German half-track rolls down the icy road, its engine coughing smoke. The boy fires. The rocket screams out, strikes true, and the vehicle erupts in flames. The cheer that follows is raw, defiant, triumphant. For once the hunter has been hunted, and across the lines the Germans are taking notes. They've captured bazookas, tested them, studied their rockets. Engineers in grey coats sketch designs late into the night. They'll soon produce their own answers. The Panzerfaust, cheap and disposable, and the Panzerschreck, a larger, nastier cousin of the bazooka itself. In a way, the bazooka is both weapon and seed, planting ideas in enemy soil that will sprout into new terrors. Quirky scene. American officers visiting Soviet units sometimes witnessed their allies using the bazooka in creative ways. One GI swore he saw a Russian aim at a low-flying German plane. The rocket fizzled and crashed harmlessly in the snow, but the attempt sparked a round of laughter. "If it flies, shoot it," the soldier shrugged. It was reckless, absurd, and strangely endearing. Back in the West, rumors swirl. Reports filter home that the Soviets are copying the bazooka, experimenting with their own versions. Some claim they're perfecting a handheld rocket that will surpass the American original. Others dismiss it as propaganda. Historians still debate how much Soviet design later influenced the famous RPG-7 of the Cold War. Was it a direct descendant of the bazooka, or just a cousin, born of parallel ideas? The line is blurred, tangled in secrecy and pride. For you trudging through snow beside these new comrades, the debate doesn't matter. What matters is the look in their eyes, the sudden spark when they realize they're not helpless against tanks. You've seen that spark before in Sicily's alleys, in North Africa's dunes. It's the same every time. Hope mingled with disbelief, blooming in the face of steel. At night in a drafty hut, you share a tin of sardines with a Soviet loader. He grins through frostbitten lips, raises the tin and clinks it against the bazooka tube like a toast. You both laugh. Strange how a joke named pipe can build bridges across languages, across continents, across the frozen wastelands of war. And as you drift to sleep, you realize the bazooka has traveled farther than you imagined. From American workshops to Russian trenches, from dusty deserts to icy forests, it has become more than just a weapon. It's a story, a rumor, a symbol, sometimes flawed, sometimes exaggerated, but always powerful enough to make even giants falter. You march northward now, the snow giving way to spring mud, and the whispers reach your ears. The Germans have something new. At first it sounds like another rumor, the kind that breeds in trenches when soldiers have too much time to think. But soon enough you see the truth. German infantry, once as powerless as you had been against tanks, now sling strange tubes across their shoulders. They look hauntingly familiar. The Panzerfaust and the Panzerschreck. Germany's answer to the bazooka. The Panzerfaust is crude, almost laughably so at first glance. A single tube with a bulbous warhead on the end, designed for one shot and then discarded. You pick one up after a skirmish, the paint still warm, the word Achtung stenciled on the side. It feels like something a farmhand might have cobbled together out of plumbing supplies and wishful thinking. And yet when fired, it spits a rocket-powered grenade capable of punching through even thick Allied armor. The Panzerschreck is nastier still, a blatant copy of your own bazooka, only bigger, meaner, more intimidating. Captured bazookas had been rushed back to German engineers, who tweaked the design and upsized it. The result? So 88mm rocket launcher that looks like the bazooka's older, crueler brother. They even bolt a shield onto the front to protect the gunner from backblast. The name itself means tank terror, and it earns that reputation quickly. You crouch in a hedgerow and watch as a squad of German infantry sets up. A Sherman tank clanks down the road, its turret scanning lazily. One German shoulders the Panzerfaust, fires, and the rocket arcs through the air with a hiss. It slams into the Sherman's flank, blooming fire. The tank shudders, crew scrambling to escape. For the first time, you feel what the Germans must have felt when they first faced your bazooka. The sickening realization that infantry can bite back. Quirky detail. German soldiers nicknamed the Panzerfaust Ofenrohr or stovepipe, the same way you had laughed at bazooka. War has a funny way of repeating itself, turning plumbing supplies into tank killers and giving them names that sound like something from a handyman's shop rather than a battlefield. Soldiers joked about carrying stoves into battle, though no one laughed once the weapon proved itself. The arrival of these weapons sparks a debate that still rages among historians. Who really had the better infantry anti-tank system? Some argue the German Panzerfaust, being disposable and cheap, was superior. Others insist the American bazooka's reusability and versatility made it more effective overall. The truth is, both were terrifying in their own way, and both forced tanks to rethink their supremacy. You sling your bazooka a little tighter on your back, aware now that the balance has shifted again. It isn't just infantry against tanks anymore. It's infantry against infantry. Both sides armed with pipes that can punch through armor like tin. The battlefield feels smaller, more dangerous. Every hedge, every barn, every ruined wall might hide a man with a tube capable of ending you. And the Germans learn quickly. They organized tank hunting teams, small squads armed with Panzerfausts, stalking the flanks of advancing Shermans. They lurk in ruins, wait for tanks to pass, then strike at the vulnerable rear. You see the smoking hulks afterward, black scars against green fields, and you realize the terror you once dealt out has come full circle. Quirky scene. One GI recalled watching a German youth, barely 16, maybe younger, lug a Panzerfaust out of a barn. His uniform was oversized, his boots unlaced. He steadied the weapon clumsily, fired and miraculously hit a Sherman's track. The tank spun out, immobilized. The boy dropped the tube and sprinted back into the barn. Looked like he was late for school, the GI muttered afterward. War had turned children into tank killers. You can't help but wonder if the bazooka itself, that American invention, planted this dark seed. Without your weapon, would the Germans have pushed so quickly to arm their infantry with portable launchers? Would villages and hedgerows now echo with dueling tubes, each side firing rockets at tanks and each other? Historians still argue whether Germany would have devised the Panzerfaust without the bazooka's inspiration, or if necessity alone would have birthed it. For you, though, these questions are luxuries. What matters is survival. You crouch lower in the ditch, eyes scanning every ruined farmhouse for the glint of a tube. The bazooka feels heavier now, not just a weapon, but a reminder of the arms race you helped start. At night, huddled by a small fire, you and your loader joke darkly. "We invent it, they copy it, then they make it better," he says, poking the flames with a stick. You grin weakly. "At least ours has a better name. Bazooka sounds friendly. Panzerschreck sounds like something that eats children. And yet even in this grim symmetry, there's a strange comfort. You're not helpless. Neither are they. The battlefield has leveled, however brutally. Both sides now march with pipes slung across their shoulders, both sides whispering about tank terror, both sides shaping the war with every hiss of a rocket. As you drift into uneasy sleep, you think about that balance. The bazooka, once a joke-turned-miracle, has now birthed its mirror in German hands. The question no longer is whether infantry can kill tanks. The question is, who will fire first? The summer of 1944 brings you to Normandy, and the hedgerows rise like green walls around you. They're not the gentle hedges of a garden. They're ancient earthen embankments thick with roots and brambles, taller than a man, and strong enough to stop a tank cold. Every field is a box, every lane a trap, every sound amplified in the claustrophobic maze. And in this strange landscape, the bazooka becomes both salvation and curse. You crouch in the damp earth beneath a wall of tangled brush. The smell of crushed leaves and churned soil fills your nose. Somewhere beyond the hedge, the grinding clatter of panzer treads creeps closer. In the open desert, at least, you could see your enemy. Here you hear them long before you see them, and every sudden snap of a twig makes your heart stutter. The squad shifts nervously. Your loader crouches beside you, rocket clutched in his hand. He whispers, "Feels like we're hunting ghosts." He's not wrong. The hedgerows swallow sound, distort distance. Her tank can be 50 yards away and sound as if it's on top of you. Suddenly the ground trembles. The tank crests the lane, its turret swiveling. You shoulder the bazooka, feeling the tube scrape against roots overhead. The iron sight is barely visible through the foliage, but you steady your breath. The rocket slides in. The trigger hums in your hand. Whoosh! The blast lights up the hedge, backblast scorching the leaves, smoke stinging your eyes. The rocket slams into the tank's side. Flames blossom, branches shiver, and the machine halts with a shriek of tortured steel. You and your loader tumble back into the mud as enemy rifles chatter. The hedge behind you smolders, the air thick with burning leaves and cordite. This is Normandy's nightmare. Point-blank battles where tanks and infantry clash at ranges closer than a city street. In these tight hedgerows, the bazooka becomes a king. Artillery can't always reach you, and anti-tank guns can't be hauled into every lane. But two men with a rocket tube, they can turn a green wall into a killing ground. Quirky detail. GIs began naming the hedgerows themselves, scrawling nicknames on maps. Suicide Alley, Walker Blood Lane, Hell's Hedges. Some soldiers joked that every hedgerow had its own personality. One was stingy with cover, another generous with firing lanes. Men wrote home complaining not just about Germans, but about the green monsters they had to fight through. But for all its usefulness, the bazooka here also reveals its flaws more painfully than ever. Firing from inside hedgerows often meant dealing with the backblast igniting brush. More than one team nearly cooked themselves alive after firing in cramped cover. The smoke trail was even deadlier. It cut through the greenery like a flare, giving away your exact position. More than once you barely scrambled clear, as machine gun bursts ripped the hedge where you'd just fired. Historians still argue about whether Normandy was the bazooka's finest hour or its cruelest test. Some point to the endless German tank wrecks lining lanes as proof of its effectiveness. Others note that heavier armor, like the Panther and Tiger, shrugged off frontal hits with alarming ease. Against those giants, the bazooka was often relegated to aiming at tracks, rear armor, or even side turrets, shots that required nerve and suicidal proximity. You remember one such encounter vividly. A Tiger rumbled down a narrow lane, its armor gleaming dark under the canopy. Your squad froze. Every rifle felt like a toy. Then the sergeant barked, "Bazooka team, forward!" Heart hammering, you and your loader crawled through muck to a gap in the hedge. You waited, breath shallow, until the monster's flank rolled past. Then fire. The rocket struck the rear, smoke coughing out of the engine deck. The Tiger slowed, then stopped. You didn't wait to see if it was dead. You just ran. The memory clings to you, less as triumph than as survival. In the hedgerows, you don't feel like a hero. You feel like prey that somehow manages to bite back. Quirky scene. Some GIs, desperate to steady their aim in the uneven hedges, lashed their bazookas to fence posts or tree trunks. They turned them into impromptu fixed guns, bracing them so the tube wouldn't wobble. One soldier even dug a shallow pit, laid the bazooka in it and fired it like a cannon. The sergeant nearly had a fit, but the shot worked. Improvisation became second nature in this leafy labyrinth, and still the Germans adapted. Tanks began advancing with infantry screens, wary of bazooka ambushes. Panzer crews fired into hedges blindly, spraying shells into greenery on the chance someone was hiding with a tube. Villagers whispered that the forests themselves burned from the constant blasts. The hedgerows, once peaceful farmland, had become a patchwork of craters and blackened scars. You sit at dusk, leaning against the hedge, listening to the cicadas hum once more. Your loader passes you a tin of rations. You both eat in silence, too drained for words. The bazooka lies across your lap, its paint chipped, its tube warm from firing. It feels less like a weapon now, and more like an extension of your own body, flawed, dangerous, but essential. And you think, not for the first time, about the strange journey of this pipe. Born in American workshops, tested in deserts, laughed at for its name, and now the deciding factor in a maze of European hedgerows, it has grown with the war just as you have, both battered but still here. Historians may debate numbers, effectiveness, strategy, but for you crouched under leaves that still smolder from backblast, there is no debate. The bazooka isn't perfect. But in Normandy, in these green-walled killing grounds, it's the only thing that makes the difference between being crushed under steel or living to fire again. The hedgerows of Normandy blur behind you, replaced now by an endless parade of tinkering hands and battlefield improvisations. Because once the bazooka was in soldiers' hands, it wasn't long before the troops themselves started to improve it, sometimes with genius, sometimes with pure mischief. You're sitting on an overturned ammo crate one evening, the bazooka across your knees, watching as a corporal squats beside his launcher with a file and a bit of string. "The sights are garbage," he mutters, scraping away at the metal. He's right. The crude iron rings often bent in the field, and at range the rockets had the grace of a paper airplane in a windstorm. So soldiers invented their own fixes, bent wire twisted into crosshairs, chalk marks scrawled onto the tube, even peep sights cannibalized from rifles. One sergeant in Italy strapped the scope from a broken Springfield rifle onto his bazooka. It looked absurd, a Frankenstein weapon with a hunting optic bolted on, but the man swore he could hit a tank at twice the usual range. Did it actually work? Nobody knows, but the story spread, and soon half the platoon was looking for glass to tape onto their tubes. Another quirk: camouflage. The bazooka's long, shiny tube stood out like a flag against mud and brush, so soldiers painted them with whatever they had. Mud-smeared thick green stripes slapped on with leftover paint, even strips of burlap tied around the barrel. One imaginative private wrapped his entire bazooka in chicken wire, stuffing leaves into it like a bad salad. It snagged on everything, but he insisted it was invisible to Jerry. You watch these modifications with a mixture of amusement and admiration. The Army issues weapons. Soldiers make them livable. The bazooka wasn't sacred. It was clay to be molded, quirky detail. In one unit, men decorated their bazookas like hot rods. Flames painted along the tube, pin-up girls sketched in chalk, names like Tankbuster Betty scrawled in looping letters. Commanders frowned, but morale soared. A man with a named weapon fires it with just a little more swagger. But improvisation wasn't just cosmetic. Some men tried extending the barrel slightly, hoping it would stabilize the rocket's flight. Others tinkered with fuses, shaving milliseconds off detonation to improve penetration. These field hacks weren't always safe. One unlucky GI misjudged his modification and ended up with a rocket that exploded just yards from the muzzle. The crater it left was impressive. The sergeant's lecture afterward was even more so. Historians still debate whether these modifications genuinely improved performance or simply gave soldiers confidence. Was the bazooka really more accurate with a wire crosshair taped on, or did the gunner just believe it was, and so steadied his hand? Some argue that the psychological boost alone justified the tinkering. Others claim it was wasted effort, soldiers dressing up a fundamentally flawed weapon. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. You remember one loader in Normandy who carried a piece of chalk everywhere. After every shot, he'd carefully chalk a little mark on the tube, a ritual of sorts. He claimed it calmed the bazooka's spirit, as though the weapon were alive. His gunner played along, swearing their shots flew straighter after the ritual. You laughed at first, But when their team notched 3 hits in a row, you stopped laughing. Improvisation extended beyond the weapon itself. Some squads dug shallow pits, propping bazookas up like makeshift mortars to lob rockets over hedges. It wasn't accurate, but the psychological effect of rockets raining down was enough to unsettle German troops. One inventive soldier rigged a pair of bazookas side by side, joking that he'd invented the double-barrel special. The contraption lasted exactly 1 shot before shaking itself apart. Still, the laughter it inspired carried through a grim week. Even ammunition became a canvas for creativity. Men doodled on rocket casings, cartoons of Hitler, crude jokes, even love notes to sweethearts back home. One GI scrawled, "Dear Helga, sorry for the inconvenience" on his rocket, before firing it into a German half-track. Dark humor, yes, but in war humor is oxygen. You sit by the fire one night, your own bazooka leaning against the wall, and reflect on all this tinkering. The official manuals never mentioned scopes, chalk, or chicken wire. They certainly didn't mention painting flames down the side. But the battlefield has never cared much for manuals. What matters is what works, or at least what feels like it works. And isn't that the essence of the bazooka itself? A crude idea tinkered into existence, perfected in the field. A weapon born not of polished laboratories, but of necessity and a little desperation. Maybe every modification, no matter how absurd, is part of the same story. A story of soldiers refusing to accept helplessness, refusing to let steel monsters roll over them without a fight. Historians may continue to debate whether these field modifications were effective. But you know what you saw. Men growing braver, prouder, more resourceful with every scrape of a file, every streak of mud, every doodle of flames on a tube. The bazooka wasn't just evolving. It was becoming theirs. As you drift to sleep, you imagine all the bazookas scattered across Europe, each one unique, each one bearing the fingerprints of the men who carried it. Some painted, some scarred, some wrapped in burlap, some chalked with tally marks. 1,000 variations of the same crude pipe, all united in one purpose: to make giants fall. And tomorrow, when you shoulder your own, maybe you'll scratch something onto it too. Not because it will make the rocket fly straighter, but because it will remind you that this pipe, ridiculous as it looks, belongs to you, not just the army. And in that sense, the bazooka has become more than a weapon. It's become a canvas of survival. The next day begins with the familiar rasp of metal on metal, but it isn't gunfire. It's the sound of you dragging the bazooka up from the mud. The tube is battered, dented, scarred from weeks of use, but still functional. As you sling it across your shoulder, you're reminded of the thing every rookie learns on their first day. The bazooka is as dangerous to its friends as it is to its enemies. That back blast. Every time you fire, it erupts like a dragon's breath. Fire, dust, smoke blasting from the rear of the tube in a violent exhale. It scorches hedges, singes walls, ignites thatched roofs, and if you're unlucky, burns your comrades. You've seen men lose eyebrows, felt the sting of grit driven into your eyes, smelled the sharp stink of scorched uniforms, and worse, the backblast is like a neon sign for enemy gunners. You fire once, and the Germans know exactly where you are. Your sergeant hammers it into you daily. Clear the back. Always clear the back, you learn to shout before firing, giving your loader and anyone nearby a second to duck. The phrase becomes instinct. Some men turn it into a joke. Hey, backblast clear unless you want a free haircut. But no one really laughs. Too many have been burned. You remember one rookie in Italy who crouched behind a stone wall, his loader kneeling directly behind him. The shot went out clean, But the backblast tore into the loader's face. His eyebrows, his hairline, even the stubble on his chin vanished in a puff. He was lucky that was all he lost. The squad still called him Baldy months later, but the laughter had an edge. Everyone knew it could have been worse. Quirky detail. Some soldiers tried to rig little shields behind the tube, bits of metal, wooden planks, even extra helmets, hoping to deflect the blast. It rarely worked. One improvised shield shattered like glass after a rocket launch, peppering the crew with splinters. After that, most men just learned to live with the danger, stepping wide, crouching low and keeping their heads turned when the trigger was squeezed. But as dangerous as it was to the user, the backblast had a psychological punch all its own. The roar was deafening, the flare startling, the smoke unmistakable. Even seasoned GIs admitted it rattled their nerves. Some joked that firing a bazooka was like standing inside a thunderstorm with your hair on fire. And yet, that same thunder had a strange effect on the Germans. Imagine yourself as a panzer crewman crouched inside a steel shell, ears ringing from the engine, eyes straining through narrow slits. Suddenly there's a whoosh and a blast that seems to tear the air apart. Even if the rocket misses, the sound alone makes you flinch. Some German reports described the bazooka's roar as erschreckend, frightening. Crews would slam hatches shut, pivot turrets wildly, or even reverse in panic at the sudden eruption. The weapon's noise was as much a weapon as the rocket itself. Historians still debate whether this psychological effect mattered as much as its physical damage. Was the bazooka feared because it destroyed tanks, or because its fiery roar made every man think he was next? Some argue that even when it failed to penetrate armor, it forced crews into mistakes, slowing advances, scattering formations. Others downplay the fear factor, insisting that seasoned panzermen quickly learned its limits. The truth is probably both. Steel can withstand blasts, but nerves are softer. You experience it yourself one evening in Normandy. You fire at a tank and miss. The rocket sails past, vanishing into a hedge, but the panzer jerks violently, engine roaring as it backs into a ditch. Its infantry escort scatters, firing wildly into the hedgerows. All that from one shot that didn't even connect. You exhale, realizing the bazooka's roar is sometimes as effective as its bite. Quirky scene. One squad, pinned down in a village, had no clear shots at the approaching armor. So the sergeant ordered a psychological barrage. They fired rockets deliberately into open ground, creating blasts of fire and smoke. The Germans hesitated, convinced they were surrounded by dozens of bazooka teams. By the time they realized the ruse, artillery had arrived. Soldiers laughed afterward, calling it scare shooting. Still, the weapon was no joke for those standing behind it. You grow accustomed to singed hair, to the grit of backblast in your teeth. You learn to aim quickly, fire, then dive for cover before return fire hammers your position. You learn to respect the dragon's breath. At night, by a dwindling fire, you and your loader compare scars. He shows you the faint pink streak on his wrist from a backblast flare. You lift your sleeve to reveal the spot where a gust of fire scorched your arm through your jacket. You both laugh quietly, not because it's funny, but because you survived it, and you think about the strange duality of this pipe. To the Germans, it's a terror. To you, it's both friend and foe, protector and hazard. You can't fire it without risking yourself, can't wield its power without feeling its sting. It's a reminder that every weapon in war is a bargain. You give something up to gain something else. Historians, safe in their libraries, may argue about penetration figures and kill ratios. But you know the truth. The bazooka's real story is written not just in tank wrecks, but in burned sleeves, singed eyebrows, and the constant smell of smoke clinging to uniforms. Its roar isn't just remembered by those who feared it. It's etched into the bones of those who fired it. As you roll into your blanket, ears still ringing, you whisper to your loader, "Clear the back." He grins sleepily, replying, "Always clear the back." It's not just a safety rule anymore. It's a ritual, a mantra, a bond. And in that bond, you find comfort even as the dragon waits for you to shoulder it again tomorrow. The rain falls in cold sheets, dripping down your helmet and soaking into your collar. The mud clings to your boots so heavily, it feels like each step drags a sack of bricks. And yet the bazooka doesn't care about weather. It rides on your back like an uninvited guest, heavy, stubborn, and always demanding attention. Tonight you're thinking less about tanks and more about what's inside that awkward tube, the ammunition. Because the truth is, the bazooka is only as good as the rockets you load into it. And those rockets, well, let's just say they've got personalities of their own. The standard round is the M6 rocket, tipped with a shaped charge warhead. In theory, it's supposed to punch through several inches of armor. In practice, sometimes it sails true. Sometimes it sputters like a cheap firework. And sometimes it bounces off steel with all the menace of a thrown brick. Nothing rattles your nerves quite like firing at a Panzer and watching your tank killer simply ping off the side like a pebble. You still remember one afternoon in France. A Panzer IV lumbered down a lane, its turret swinging like a hunter's gaze. You crouched, fired, and watched in disbelief as your rocket smacked into the sloped armor and ricocheted into a ditch. The tank crew didn't even flinch. Your loader swore loudly, and you both bolted before the machine gun found you. Later you laughed shakily, calling it the angry kiss round. But at the time it nearly cost you your life. Quirky detail. Soldiers gave their rockets nicknames depending on performance. A clean hit was a bullseye, a rocket that sputtered and fell short was a dud. Duck? One that struck but failed to penetrate was a tin tapper. The cruelest joke was the boomerang, for the rare misfire that wobbled, dangerously close to circling back toward the shooter. The rockets were temperamental in weather too. In cold the propellant stiffened, sometimes refusing to ignite. In heat, the fins warped, throwing off aim. Men grew superstitious, warming rockets under their armpits, whispering curses at stubborn rounds, even tapping the nose gently as if coaxing a mule. Your loader once tucked a rocket into his jacket like a baby chick, swearing it would fly better with love. Strangely enough, that shot landed true. Historians still debate whether these ammunition flaws were simply the growing pains of new technology or evidence that the bazooka was overhyped. Some point to reports of frequent failures, arguing the weapon was unreliable. Others counter with records of destroyed tanks, insisting that when it worked brilliantly. The arguments persist in books and articles, but for you, crouched in the mud with a live rocket humming in the tube, debates don't matter. What matters is whether this next round flies straight. There's another problem too, storage. Rockets are bulky, awkward, and not exactly safe. Carrying a half-dozen across rough ground feels like juggling lit matches while running a marathon. Soldiers lash them together with string, stuff them into packs, even carry them in their arms like bundles of firewood. You can imagine the nervous jokes. "Careful, boys, don't trip. We don't want fireworks tonight." And yet, for all their quirks, the rockets occasionally surprise you with perfection. You remember firing from the edge of a wood, aiming at the track of a panther. The rocket leapt, hissed, and struck exactly where you wanted. Sparks flew, the treads snapped, and the tank ground to a halt, crew spilling out in panic. For one glorious moment, the bazooka was everything the manuals promised. Quirky scene, some soldiers experimented with alternative uses for the rockets. One squad strapped a rocket to a makeshift sled, hoping to launch supplies across a flooded ditch. The rocket veered off course, scattering rations everywhere, but the laughter that followed lifted spirits for days. Another GI claimed he tried fishing with a rocket, aiming into a pond. The blast stunned a dozen fish, but also destroyed the squad's laundry, which had been soaking nearby. The rockets also became part of trench barter. A man with extra rounds could trade them for cigarettes, chocolate, or favors. You once swapped 2 rockets for a dry blanket, a deal you still consider one of the best trades of your life. Rockets were heavy, uncomfortable to carry, and sometimes unreliable, but in the right hands they were priceless. Of course, the Germans weren't ignorant. They quickly realized that bazooka rockets were less effective against heavier armor. By late 1944, Panthers and Tigers could often shrug off frontal hits. German crews painted over scorch marks with fresh coats of camouflage, dismissing them as battle scratches. But those same crews still feared side and rear shots, and the constant risk kept them on edge. Even when a rocket failed, the threat of it was enough to shape tactics. Historians argue endlessly about the statistics: penetration angles, armor thickness, failure rates. Some insist the bazooka was outdated by the time it faced German heavy tanks. Others point out that most combat wasn't against Tigers, but against lighter vehicles, half-tracks and bunkers, targets the bazooka destroyed with ease. The truth, as always, is more complicated. For you, the reality is simpler. Every rocket is a gamble. Each time your loader slides one into the tube, you feel the weight not just of steel, but of chance. Will it fly? Will it hit? Will it punch through? You never know until the smoke clears. At night, you sit cleaning the tube while your loader fiddles with the rockets, lining them up like strange green candles. You both grin at the absurdity of it all. The war fought with rifles, tanks, planes, and ships, and here you are betting your life on a pipe and some temperamental fireworks. And yet, you wouldn't trade it. Because for all their quirks, all their failures, those rockets have given you something no rifle ever could: the power to stare down a tank and believe you have a chance. As you roll into your blanket, the rain pattering on your helmet, you think about tomorrow. Another lane, another hedge, another tank rolling closer, another rocket waiting in the tube. And you know you'll whisper the same prayer every bazooka man does: fly straight, fly true. Don't be a dud duck tonight. The mud of France clings to your boots, but tonight it's not mud that weighs you down, it's dread. Word has spread through the ranks. A Tiger tank prowls the sector. The very name makes men tense. Tigers are whispered about like mythical beasts, as if they're invulnerable dragons in steel hide. And now you, with your bazooka slung across your shoulder, are expected to hunt one. The Tiger Eye is a brute. 88mm cannon, nearly 70 tons of steel, armor so thick it shrugs off most weapons. The first time you see one, it seems unreal, like a nightmare painted black and gray. It rumbles across the horizon, shrugging off small arms fire as if it were rain. The ground shakes beneath its treads. Your loader whispers, "That thing's unstoppable." You don't disagree. The bazooka manual insists it can penetrate up to 3 inches of armor. The Tiger's front plates, over 4, which means one truth: don't bother aiming at its nose. If you want a chance, you'll need to strike its sides, its rear, its tracks, or the thinner spots near hatches. Getting to those angles means one thing: getting dangerously close. You crouch behind a barn wall as the Tiger approaches, engine snarling like a beast. Sweat drips into your eyes despite the cold. Your loader hands you a rocket, his hands trembling. "Aim for the tracks," he mutters, as if saying it aloud might make it easier. The Tiger clanks closer. You shoulder the bazooka, heart hammering. The sight wobbles, the iron ring almost laughable against so massive a target. You squeeze the trigger. Whoosh! The rocket streaks out, smacking into the side armor with a fiery flash. When the smoke clears, the Tiger keeps coming. The rocket has scorched the paint, nothing more. Reload. Your loader shoves another rocket in. This time you wait, every nerve screaming as the tank looms larger. You let it pass, then fire at the rear. The explosion rocks the engine deck. Smoke coughs out of the vents. The Tiger halts, crew shouting inside. For a moment you dare to hope. Then the turret begins to swing towards you. You don't wait. You and your loader dive into a ditch, mud swallowing you whole as the Tiger's gun booms. The barn behind you disintegrates, timbers flying. You crawl, scramble, run. Behind you, the Tiger wheezes smoke but does not die. That's the uneasy truth about bazookas versus Tigers. It's not about killing, it's about crippling. You learn to aim for tracks, to blind the giant by snapping its ankles. A stopped Tiger is still deadly, but at least artillery or tank destroyers can finish it. Infantry alone, you can only wound the beast and hope it's enough. Quirky detail. Soldiers invented nicknames for their shots. Aiming for tracks was a leg breaker, aiming for rear. Armor was a butt shot, and the rare chance of hitting the turret ring, the vulnerable, seam between turret and hull, was called threading the needle. Few ever managed it, but those who did swore it felt like splitting an arrow in midair. Historians still argue over how effective bazookas truly were against Tigers. Some claim stories of infantrymen killing Tigers outright were exaggerated, propaganda to keep morale high. Others point to documented cases where a lucky rocket found a weak spot and brewed up the monster. The debate rages on, but the soldiers in the field didn't have time for arguments. They had only rockets, sweat, and fear. One night, after a long day of cat and mouse with German armor, you sit by the fire listening to stories. A private insists he saw a bazooka team kill a Tiger with 3 shots. Another scoffs, saying it must have been a Panzer IV misidentified in the heat of battle. A sergeant interrupts. Doesn't matter if it was a Tiger or a Tinker toy. Point is, you shoot, you scare 'em, you stop 'em. That's our job. And that's what you cling to. The knowledge that even if your bazooka can't slay dragons, it can at least make them stumble. Sometimes that's enough. Quirky scene. One squad, desperate and half-mad, strapped explosives to a wheelbarrow and pushed it toward a Tiger stuck in a ditch. The contraption bounced, wobbled, and finally detonated short of the target. The crew inside, startled, abandoned the tank anyway. Later, the bazooka men joked that their tube had softened it up first, even though their rockets had done little. It didn't matter. The story gave them something to laugh about. You clean your weapon in silence that night, staring at the battered tube. You wonder if it's foolish to pit plumbing against dragons. And yet, you've seen the mighty Tiger cough smoke, seen crews bail out under rocket fire. Maybe the bazooka isn't the sword that kills giants. Maybe it's the sling that slows them down, gives David a chance to run, to regroup, to live another day. Historians love to tally armor thickness, penetration charts, kill counts. But the men who carried the bazooka remember something different. The sheer nerve it took to aim at a Tiger, knowing your rocket might bounce like a pebble. They remember the sound of the whoosh, the smell of cordite, the moment of hope when smoke blossomed on steel. They remember the way even a failed shot could make the invincible hesitate. As you drift into uneasy sleep, you hear the Tiger's engine in your dreams. The rumble, the roar, the endless grind of treads. But in your hands you also feel the bazooka. Awkward, flawed, and yet somehow enough. Because war isn't about perfect weapons. It's about imperfect men with imperfect tools, standing against monsters and somehow holding the line. And tomorrow, when another tiger prowls the fields, you'll shoulder the tube again. Not because you believe you can kill it outright, but because you believe you can make it fear you. The jungle greets you like a furnace. Hair thick as soup, mosquitoes humming, palms dripping. You're sweating before you even shoulder the bazooka, and your loader mutters that the tube feels twice as heavy in this heat. You've traded hedgerows for coral ridges, tanks for bunkers. Out here, the bazooka isn't hunting steel beasts, it's cracking doors. A pillbox squats ahead, half buried in sand. A machine gun barks through a slit no wider than your fist. Rifle fire pings uselessly. You kneel behind a palm stump, rocket sliding into place. Backblast clear, you whisper. The whoosh spits smoke and fire. The rocket diving straight into the shadow. Concrete coughs dust, the gun falters. For one heartbeat, the island holds its breath. Then the gun chatters again. You reload, fire once more, and this time the embrasure slumps. A Marine rushes with a satchel charge, and the bunker is silent for good. That's the rhythm of the Pacific: smoke, rocket, charge, flame. The bazooka doesn't kill tanks here. It opens wounds in stone so others can finish the job. Quirky scene. Some soldiers experimented with alternative uses for the rockets. One squad strapped a rocket to a makeshift sled, hoping to launch supplies across a flooded ditch. The rocket veered off course, scattering rations everywhere, but the laughter that followed lifted spirits for days. Another GI claimed he tried fishing with a rocket, aiming into a pond. The blast stunned a dozen fish, but also destroyed the squad's laundry, which had been soaking nearby. The rockets also became part of trench barter. A man with extra rounds could trade them for cigarettes, chocolate, or favors. You once swapped 2 rockets for a dry blanket, a deal you still consider one of the best trades of your life. Rockets were heavy, uncomfortable to carry, and sometimes unreliable, but in the right hands they were priceless. Of course, the Germans weren't ignorant. They quickly realized that bazooka rockets were less effective against heavier armor. By late 1944, Panthers and Tigers could often shrug off frontal hits. German crews painted over scorch marks with fresh coats of camouflage, dismissing them as battle scratches. But those same crews still feared side and rear shots, and the constant risk kept them on edge. Even when a rocket failed, the threat of it was enough to shape tactics. Historians argue endlessly about the statistics: penetration angles, armor thickness, failure rates. Some insist the bazooka was outdated by the time it faced German heavy tanks. Others point out that most combat wasn't against Tigers, but against lighter vehicles, half-tracks and bunkers, targets the bazooka destroyed with ease. The truth, as always, is more complicated. For you, the reality is simpler. Every rocket is a gamble. Each time your loader slides one into the tube, you feel the weight not just of steel, but of chance. Will it fly? Will it hit? Will it punch through? You never know until the smoke clears. At night, you sit cleaning the tube while your loader fiddles with the rockets, lining them up like strange green candles. You both grin at the absurdity of it all. The war fought with rifles, tanks, planes, and ships, and here you are betting your life on a pipe and some temperamental fireworks. And yet, you wouldn't trade it. Because for all their quirks, all their failures, those rockets have given you something no rifle ever could: the power to stare down a tank and believe you have a chance. As you roll into your blanket, the rain pattering on your helmet, you think about tomorrow. Another lane, another hedge, another tank rolling closer. Another rocket waiting in the tube. And you know you'll whisper the same prayer every bazooka man does. Fly straight, fly true. Don't be a dud duck tonight. The mud of France clings to your boots, but tonight it's not mud that weighs you down, it's dread. Word has spread through the ranks. A Tiger tank prowls the sector. The very name makes men tense. Tigers are whispered about like mythical beasts, as if they're invulnerable dragons in steel hide. And now you, with your bazooka slung across your shoulder, are expected to hunt one. The Tiger Eye is a brute. 88mm cannon, nearly 70 tons of steel, armor so thick it shrugs off most weapons. The first time you see one, it seems unreal, like a nightmare painted black and grey. It rumbles across the horizon, shrugging off small arms fire as if it were rain. The ground shakes beneath its treads. Your loader whispers, "That thing's unstoppable." You don't disagree. The bazooka manual insists it can penetrate up to 3 inches of armor. The Tiger's front plates, over 4, which means one truth. Don't bother aiming at its nose. If you want a chance, you'll need to strike its sides, its rear, its tracks, or the thinner spots near hatches. Getting to those angles means one thing: getting dangerously close. You crouch behind a barn wall as the Tiger approaches, engine snarling like a beast. Sweat drips into your eyes despite the cold. Your loader hands you a rocket, his hands trembling. "Aim for the tracks," he mutters, as if saying it aloud might make it easier. The Tiger clanks closer. You shoulder the bazooka, heart hammering. The sight wobbles, the iron ring almost laughable against so massive a target. You squeeze the trigger. Whoosh! The rocket streaks out, smacking into the side armor with a fiery flash. When the smoke clears, the Tiger keeps coming. The rocket has scorched the paint, nothing more. Reload. Your loader shoves another rocket in. This time you wait, every nerve screaming as the tank looms larger. You let it pass, then fire at the rear. The explosion rocks the engine deck. Smoke coughs out of the vents. The Tiger halts, crew shouting inside. For a moment you dare to hope. Then the turret begins to swing toward you. You don't wait. You and your loader dive into a ditch, mud swallowing you whole as the Tiger's gun booms. The barn behind you disintegrates, timbers flying. You crawl, scramble, run. Behind you, the Tiger wheezes smoke but does not die. That's the uneasy truth about bazookas versus Tigers. It's not about killing, it's about crippling. You learn to aim for tracks, to blind the giant by snapping its ankles. A stopped Tiger is still deadly, but at least artillery or tank destroyers can finish it. Infantry alone, you can only wound the beast and hope it's enough. Quirky detail. Soldiers invented nicknames for their shots. Aiming for tracks was a leg breaker. Aiming for rear, armor was a butt shot. And the rare chance of hitting the turret ring, the vulnerable, seam between turret and hull, was called threading the needle. Few ever managed it, but those who did swore it felt like quirky detail. Backblast in jungle brush is a nightmare. Palm fronds catch fire, roots smolder, smoke hangs under the canopy like a beacon. Some teams hack lanes behind their firing spots just so they don't barbecue themselves. Others improvise with ration tins, laying them behind the tube to catch sparks. After each shot, the tins clatter like cymbals, an accidental battle soundtrack. Firing angles change too. Against armor, you hunted flanks. Here you aim for cracks in concrete or coral seams weakened by earlier blasts. A shot at the edge of an embrasure often spalls fragments inward, making defenders duck. A rocket into a cave mouth can shake rubble loose, sealing the hole. Historians still debate whether bazookas were really decisive against fortifications. Some reports praise them as lifesavers. Others claim flamethrowers and satchels did the real work. Truth is, you see them complement each other. The bazooka's roar stuns defenders long enough for flame to follow. Without that pause, men carrying satchels wouldn't make it 10 feet. You remember one cave on Peleliu. The mouth spat fire every few minutes, pinning down your squad. You lobbed a smoke grenade, glimpsed the outline inside, and fired. The shaped charge slammed into coral, coughing dust. When the haze cleared, the opening was jagged, smaller, quiet. You never knew if the rocket killed anyone, but it gave the squad time to move. That, you realize, is the bazooka's real role here. Not glory, just breathing room. Quirky scene. Your loader once slipped and sat square on a rocket. Both of you froze, then laughed nervously when nothing happened. Another time, supply crates arrived with instructions translated badly. Keep in shade, except when in not shade. You pinned it on your foxhole wall as a motivational poster. Even in the Pacific, humor keeps you steady. Mainstream fact. By 1944, engineers already planned bigger tubes, 3.5 inches across, to handle tougher fortifications and armor. You can feel why. Some pillboxes take 4 or 5 rockets before they crumble. Each shot is sweat, smoke, risk. More punch would mean fewer tries. At dusk, you sit on driftwood, feet in the surf, bazooka gritty with coral dust beside you. Your loader opens a tin of sardines and you both grin at the absurdity. From France's hedgerows to Pacific reefs, the same salty snack follows you. You mark a tiny fish on your tube with chalk, calling it your lucky charm. And tomorrow you'll whisper the same liturgy. Load, clear, fire, move. Not for tanks this time, but for caves and bunkers carved into rock. Different enemies, same pipe, same roar. A weapon born as a joke, carried into deserts, hedges, and jungles, now prying open the hardest doors war can build. Rain pours down in fat drops that thud against your helmet and streak mud across your face. The bazooka digs into your shoulder as you slog forward, and your loader curses as his pack of rockets grows heavier with every soaked step. War is never kind, but in foul weather it feels downright spiteful. Tonight you're discovering a truth every bazooka man learns sooner or later. The jungle and the winter and the monsoon all hate your weapon as much as the enemy does. Moisture is the first enemy. The bazooka's early firing system relies on a dry cell battery to ignite the rocket. When those batteries get wet, they sulk like stubborn children. You remember one miserable night when you crouched behind a log, tiger rumors in the air, finger pressing the trigger again and again. Click, nothing. Click, nothing. The rocket sat there in the breach like an insult. You wanted to hurl the tube into the mud. Your loader tried warming the battery under his armpit, while German artillery thumped the hills. It finally sputtered to life hours later, but by then the tank had long since moved on. Snow is no kinder. In the Ardennes you dig foxholes with frozen hands, your breath clouding. Rockets stored outside swell and crack in the cold. The fins grow brittle, snapping off if handled roughly. One squad discovered a whole batch of ammunition ruined because the crates were left sitting in snowdrifts. You all learned quickly. Rockets sleep under blankets with the men. A campfire might warm your fingers, but it also warps propellant. Every night you balance the need for comfort against the risk of carrying useless fireworks. Quirky detail. Some soldiers tuck batteries into socks and tie them around their necks, like strange pendants of survival. Others shove rockets down the inside of their coats, wincing each time the fins jab. There are stories of men singing to their rockets, as if lullabies could keep them dry. Ridiculous, perhaps, but in a world where one dud can mean a tank rolling over your foxhole, no ritual seems too strange. mud adds its own insults. In Italy and France in the Pacific, you trudge through fields where every step sucks at your boots. Rockets slip from hands slick with rain and land in muck. You wipe them clean as best you can, praying the firing mechanism doesn't gum up. More than once you've watched a rocket spit halfway out of the tube and die in a hiss of smoke because grit clogged the nozzle. Your loader cursed so loudly the whole platoon heard him over the battle. Historians still argue about whether weather was the bazooka's biggest enemy or simply one more hardship among many. Some reports suggest as much as half the ammunition in certain campaigns failed due to damp conditions. Others claim most failures were exaggerations, recorded by frustrated troops. The truth, as always, sits muddy in the middle. You carry scars of weather fights. One snowy evening, pinned down by a panther on a ridge, you begged your loader for another round. He jammed a rocket in, you pulled the trigger, and nothing. The panther loomed closer, its gun yawning toward you. In desperation, you yanked the rocket out and threw it aside, half convinced it might ignite in your hands. Seconds later, artillery from behind saved you. You laughed shakily, calling it our guardian angel shell. But the fear lingered, the knowledge that the bazooka could betray you at the worst moment. Quirky scene. During a monsoon, one squad built a makeshift umbrella for their bazooka, out of ration tins hammered flat and lashed with string. It looked absurd, like a pipe wearing a hat, but it kept the firing chamber dry. They fired under that contraption, water cascading off the edges, and swore it was their lucky charm. Command didn't approve, but the squad never went into action without it again. Another time, in the Ardennes, a GI used his bazooka tube as a sled, sliding down an icy hill to reach a new position. He dented the muzzle, which nearly got him court-martialed, but he arrived in one piece and the weapon still fired. His loader dubbed him Rocket Toboggan for the rest of the winter. Weather isn't just physical, it's mental. The damp gnaws at morale, the cold stiffens hands, the endless rain drums on nerves. Each time you shoulder the bazooka, you wonder, will it fire or will the elements laugh in your face? You grow superstitious like everyone else. You knock on the tube before loading. You whistle the same tune before pulling the trigger. You scowl at clouds, as if daring them to ruin your shot. And yet sometimes, against all odds, the weapon sings true in the foulest conditions. You remember crouching in a blizzard, snow blinding you when a German half-track lurched into view. You lined up as best you could, breath freezing in your mustache, and fired. The rocket streaked bright against the whiteout and slammed into the target. Flames bloomed in the snow. For one glorious instant, the bazooka was fire itself defying the storm. Historians note that weather challenges pushed engineers to improve the weapon. By 1944, newer electrical systems replaced the worst of the unreliable batteries. Field manuals added whole sections on care in rain and cold. Soldiers improvised tarps, oiled their tubes obsessively, and stored rockets like precious eggs. It wasn't perfect, but it kept the weapon alive long enough to matter. At night, in your frozen foxhole or your dripping tent, you lie awake listening to the patter of rain or the howl of wind. The bazooka rests beside you, wrapped in canvas, its rockets tucked close. You wonder if the enemy has the same struggles, if German Panzerschreck teams also huddle over damp batteries, if Panzerfausts misfire in the snow. Somehow that thought comforts you. Weather is the one enemy that doesn't take sides. Quirky joke number 1. The bazooka's 3 settings: fire, fizzle, and drown. Quirky joke number 2. The Germans don't stop us. The weather does. Quirky joke number 3. Rain is just God's artillery. and he doesn't need a loader. You laugh with your loader at these lines, because laughter keeps your fingers warm when nothing else can, and so you endure. The rain falls, the snow bites, the mud sucks, but the bazooka remains. Imperfect, temperamental, but still there. And tomorrow, when the storm clears or doesn't, you'll shoulder it again, praying the next rocket isn't another dud duck. Because even in the worst weather, even when the tube hisses and sulks, you know one truth: a damp rocket that somehow flies straight is still better than facing steel with nothing at all. By now, the war feels like a long march of inventions chasing each other's shadows. Every new weapon spawns a counter. Every counter breeds its opposite. You've lived through the bazooka's birth, its awkward adolescence, its jungle career as a bunker buster. But the fighting winds down, and people begin to whisper about what comes after. What place does this pipe have once the guns fall silent? You find yourself in a depot yard piled high with discarded gear. Helmets dented, rifles stacked, crates of rockets cracked open like stale bread. Among the clutter, bazookas lean against walls in crooked rows, paint peeling, tubes scarred. They look less like miracles now and more like relics of some odd religion. And yet you know this isn't their end. Already engineers are sketching the next step. A larger tube, 3.5 inches across, tested in secret but destined for another war in Korea. Soldiers grumble about the size, but everyone agrees more punch is needed for heavier armor. The bazooka has proven the idea. Now the idea will outgrow the pipe. Mainstream fact: after World War II, the bazooka's design spreads like wildfire. The Germans' Panzerfaust evolves into the Soviet RPG line, which in turn inspires weapons carried into every corner of the Cold War. The concept is too good, too simple, too terrifying to disappear. Today's rocket launchers, from RPG-7s in deserts to modern guided missiles, all carry a little DNA from the skinny pipe you once fired under hedges and palms. Quirky detail: surplus bazookas pop up in unexpected places after the war. Some nations buy them in bulk. Others copy them. French soldiers in Indochina tote them against fortified positions. Guerrilla fighters in jungles. And deserts decades later wield second-hand tubes that once sat in U.S. depots. Even police departments in America occasionally receive them as military aid, scratching their heads at what to do with a tank killer in peacetime. Historians argue whether the bazooka truly changed infantry warfare or was simply a stepping stone. Some call it revolutionary, giving the common soldier the first real tool against armor. Others insist it was transitional, useful but quickly outclassed by its offspring. The debate fills chapters, but you suspect the truth lies in memory more than manuals. Because for every soldier who carried it, the bazooka was more than data. It was the moment you stopped feeling helpless. You remember Normandy's hedgerows, Sicily's alleys, Pacific pillboxes. You remember the roar in your ears, the smoke curling behind you, the loader's frantic hands. You remember the first time a tank stopped because you fired, and the shock that followed. That memory doesn't fade, no matter how many new rockets come along. At night, sitting on a dock waiting for transport home, you lean the bazooka against the post beside you. The war is nearly over. A crate of sardines rests at your feet, a final echo of the meal that once shared space with fear. You glance at the scarred tube and almost laugh. Once it was a joke named after a silly musical horn. Then it became your lifeline. Now it's a museum piece waiting for its plaque. Quirky scene. A GI in your unit days before shipping out scrawls, "Thanks for the ride," on his bazooka with chalk. He fires one last round at a practice range, then leaves the tube propped neatly against a fence. You can't help but think the bazooka deserved a salute. The legacy lingers in strange ways. Kids back home use bazooka as slang for anything big and loud. Bubble gum takes the name, wrapped in bright paper, as if to make the word friendly again. Veterans hear it and smile, some with pride, some with a touch of bitterness. The bazooka is no longer just a weapon. It's a story, a memory, a symbol of a time when a pipe and a rocket changed the way men face steel. And you, as you watch the horizon soften into dawn, know you'll carry that symbol forever. The bazooka taught you fear, taught you trust, taught you that even the smallest man could shoulder a giant's burden. It may rest in depots and museums now, but its echo lives on every time a soldier steadies a launcher and whispers, "Backblast clear." The guns fall silent at last, though in your head they never really do. The war is ending, and with it the days of lugging a pipe across mud, snow and sand. You stand in a depot yard stacked high with cast-off gear, rifles bundled like kindling, helmets dented and forgotten, crates of rockets whose labels fade in the sun. A row of bazookas leans against a wall, their paint chipped, their tubes scarred, looking more like scrap than the terror they once inspired. You pick one up, feel the familiar weight, and a tide of memory washes over you. Sicily's narrow alleys, where tanks thundered like gods and you learned to ambush in shadows. Normandy's hedgerows, where you carved fire through green walls thick with roots and fear. The steaming jungles of the Pacific, where the bazooka became a door knocker against coral bunkers. And the icy nights in the Ardennes, when you prayed the batteries would work before the tiger's barrel found you. Each scar on the tube feels like a chapter written in smoke and sweat. Mainstream fact: when the war ends, armies don't simply discard ideas, they refine them. Engineers are already sketching heavier launchers, bigger rockets, more reliable firing systems. The bazooka has proven the concept, and now its children will walk into the next war. By Korea, a fatter 3.5-inch super bazooka will shoulder the burden. Built to crack Russian T-34s, the pipe you carried will become history, but its descendants will fight on for decades. Quirky detail: back home, bazooka takes on new lives. A chewing gum brand adopts the name, wrapping sweetness around the word once tied to fear. Cartoonists doodle soldiers with comically oversized tubes. Even jazz musicians joke about blowing the bazooka. It's as if the world, weary of blood, needs to laugh again at the name that once echoed across battlefields. Historians still argue about the bazooka's true measure. Was it decisive, the equalizer that gave infantry a chance against tanks? Or was it only a stepping stone, quickly outpaced by heavier armor and deadlier weapons? The truth is muddled, but you know what matters. In the mud and smoke of war, the bazooka gave you something priceless. It gave you hope. You rest the tube back against the wall and take a deep breath. The air smells of oil, rust, and the faint sweetness of spring. Around you, men pack their duffels, laugh nervously, talk about going home. The war will end, but the echoes will linger. Every whoosh of a rocket, every roar of backblast, every laugh shared over sardines and scorched uniforms, they are stitched into you forever. And now, at last, it is time to set the weapon down and step away. So now, let your breathing slow. The clang of tanks, the whoosh of rockets, the roar of backblast, let them fade like waves retreating from a shore. Picture the bazooka itself leaning quiet in a museum corner, its green paint chipped, its story waiting patiently for curious eyes. No smoke, no fear, no hurried loader. Just silence. Imagine yourself back in that farmhouse, the one with embers still glowing in the hearth. Outside, the hedgerows are green and calm. No engines growl, no shadows move. The bazooka rests nearby, harmless now, just a pipe that once roared like thunder. You reach out and touch its cool surface, and instead of dread, you feel gratitude for the men who carried it, for the lives it spared, for the lessons it left behind. The war has ended in our story, and in this gentle moment, so too does the noise in your head. Let the rumble of tanks drift away. Let the crackle of rockets soften into memory. All that remains is quiet, soft and steady, like the hush of night air through an open window. Close your eyes. The past is behind you, the weight is lifted, and the future is calm. Whatever battles still trouble your thoughts, know this. You survived them, you endured them, and you've laid the weapon down. Rest easy now. The giants are gone. The pipe is silent, and you are safe.